Well, good evening. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and I bring you very warm greetings from Malibu, California, where I'm delighted to say I have a return trip planned for tomorrow afternoon. But it's great to be here in DC, a city that's very near and dear to my heart. I actually did my undergrad here at GW and grew up in the Northeast. And it's always great to make these visits to DC in the winter because it always reminds me why I love living on campus at Pepperdine. But this is one of a number of events that we have hosted and will continue to host here in Washington because the city itself is a very important one to not only the School of Public Policy, but also Pepperdine University. Just a couple months ago, we hosted a salon here at the Army and Navy Club with another one of our senior fellows, Robert C. O'Brien, former National Security Advisor, discussing issues related to national security, which is obviously a very important topic to us at Pepperdine and the School of Public Policy. But tonight, we're going to explore another very important subject matter at Pepperdine and to Pepperdine, that being free speech, human dignity, and religious freedom. I want to thank our partners for this evening. First, our friends at the Institute for Religion and Democracy and our friend Mark Tooley. Please join me in thanking them as our co-hosts. And I also want to thank our friends at the Oversight Board. We're going to talk a little bit more about their work, but it's been a delight to partner again with my friend Rachel Barkley, so please join me in thanking them. So I'm hoping some of you were attracted by the title of this discussion, which if it weren't urgent enough, we try to put in every bit of urgent words into the title. Crises, election, religious liberty, freedom of speech. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. And who better to do that with than the two people seated on my left and right. I'll begin with, to my left, Paolo Carozza, who is a professor at Notre Dame, their School of Law, also has a second appointment in their political science department, but is an expert in issues related to human dignity, freedom of speech, and freedom of expression. He also serves on the Oversight Board, on their advisory council. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also joining me is one of our newest senior fellows at the School of Public Policy, Knox Thames. Knox, beside being a senior fellow with us, also runs this program that you see here, the program on global faith and inclusive societies. He's also a visiting expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace and is a noted expert on religious freedom, especially in the global context. So why don't we, and again, just to back up one quick second on the agenda, these are in our tradition of salon events. What we like to do is make these conversations. We intentionally keep these rather intimate and small, and we do that by inviting very particular people to it. And I know from seeing many of the faces here, people I know, that we have some experts on these subjects already, and we want to make sure to engage them in this conversation. So I'm going to begin with some, maybe set the table here with the both of you, but please know that we've reserved the balance of an hour together really for your questions. So please be ready to engage in this conversation. So to set the foundation, Paolo, let's begin with you. Talk a little bit about your work on the Oversight Board, how it engages with these issues related to free speech and free expression on one of the world's best known and most highly used social media platforms.
Sure. Thank you, Pete. Thanks for hosting. Thank you all for coming. It's a privilege to be here and talk about these important issues with all of you. So the Oversight Board is a body that was created about 3 years ago by Meta, but independent of Meta, and the independence is crucial to the work that it does. We're 22 experts from all around the world, different disciplines, different points of view, different backgrounds, who are tasked with making decisions in specific cases about content that should either come down from or be left on the platforms that Meta operates, Facebook and Instagram. The users can appeal to us when decisions are made about content that is taken down or left up over their objections. And then we make decisions which, by contractual arrangement with Meta, are binding on them, and Meta has agreed to implement our decisions. Together with the decisions on particular pieces of content, the Oversight Board makes policy recommendations to Meta on the broad questions that each case brings out. So obviously we can only decide a very small number of cases among the thousands that arrive to us literally every month, every week. And so we try our best to choose cases that are emblematic of larger, difficult, significant systemic issues in the global information ecosystem on these platforms and social media. And for that reason, you wouldn't be surprised that the cases that we've decided come from all parts of the world, from conflict areas in significant parts, from the war in Gaza, the war in Ukraine, and so forth, touch upon some of the most contested and controversial freedom of expression controversies. Heads of state, hate speech, incitement to violence, recruitment to terrorism, and all of these at their root are questions of freedom of expression, right? Because the core issue that we're trying to decide is how to protect freedom of expression in these contents, and under what limited circumstances is it justifiable for Meta to limit freedom of expression in the interests of the need to protect certain other human rights and protect people from violence or children from abuse and so forth. So freedom of expression is at the core of every single case that we have, but it covers a broad range of issues from all over the world.
Before turning to Knox, I'm curious, tell me, just given all the work that you've done in this field before joining the Oversight Board, tell us what most surprised you before coming on in adapting your expertise to what you ended up seeing. What on these questions around human dignity and freedom of expression, being in this very important position, most surprised you about free speech?
Right. Well, I mean, as background to that, I'll just mention that, as you know, and we're alluding to, aside from my academic appointments, I've had the privilege of serving on several different international human rights bodies in the Americas and in Europe and here in Washington. And so I've had quite a lot of experience in bodies that are sort of adjudicative, so to speak, court-like in the human rights sphere. What immediately struck me as radically different when I got to the Oversight Board from all of them. And the Oversight Board in some ways is quite similar to that, right? An independent body, we're making decisions on the basis of human rights norms about these things. What is so different is the problem of scale. Just the vastness of what we're talking about. Literally billions of pieces of content a day. 100 million enforcement decisions a day. And it's just hard to imagine how one can govern that space with any kind of consistent principle that really protects freedoms and protects the dignity of everybody involved. It's a really difficult, novel, unprecedented problem, even when you're looking at it with all of the resources of past human rights law at your disposal.
Knox, we are very grateful to have you join us fairly recently as a senior fellow, both at the Policy School with a joint appointment at our Caruso School of Law. Tell us a little bit about this new program at Pepperdine, why it makes sense at Pepperdine, and what a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, great. Well, again, thank you to the organizers for hosting this. And it's great to see so many friends in the audience. I joined Pepperdine in April after 20 years of government service focusing on promoting international religious freedom around the world. I just finished a book project, which I'm very excited about. Notre Dame will publish this summer. That book project was funded by the Templeton Religion Trust, and they invited me to apply for another longer grant, a 3-year research grant, to kind of explore the themes of the book and try to apply them. But I needed a partner. So through some very providential turns, found my way to Pepperdine. Unfortunately, we're still here in Washington, but I am looking forward to going out to Malibu in a couple weeks to teach a seminar course on international religious freedom, law, and diplomacy. But the program has 3 lines of effort. One is to engage governments, to help governments think through how do we promote international religious freedom in a way that defends the right of everybody to pursue truth as their conscience leads. It's based on my time at the State Department, different alliances that we set up, continuing to advise them, working with the OAS here in Washington, working with UN institutions abroad. A second line of effort is focused on how do we talk about religious freedom in the context of the Middle East or Asia without saying the word religious freedom? 'Cause that's a loaded term in a lot of context. So based on my work in places like Iraq, you can't help but see there are a lot of sacred heritage sites that indicate a past diversity that once existed. There's synagogues, churches, fire temples. And so we're doing research into thinking about how do we leverage the power of a community's own story of diversity, the good and the bad, to foster conversations about living together in pluralism today and respecting the beliefs of others. So it's not me coming in as a white American with a UN document, but actually listening to their stories and helping draw out the best practices. And then the last component is really focused on the American church. And I'm excited to join a Christian institution that really takes the Christian faith seriously to start a discussion about how do we, of course we advocate for persecuted Christians, but I think God calls us to advocate for all who are persecuted, and developing some narratives there that can encourage those of us who are Christians to open the aperture a bit wider. So it's exciting to be at Pepperdine, and it's been a great 9 months, and it's great to be a part of the School of Public Policy and the law school. So.
Great. Let's begin with the work that you're doing on the Oversight Board and the work that the Oversight Board is doing, especially as we enter an election season. That was part of the title for this evening's conversation. Platforms, social media platforms like Twitter, like Meta, and Instagram have really been at the heart of a number of debates around free speech, particularly as it relates to political engagement, elections, what's said about particular candidates. This whole area that we're have been looking at what's known as manipulated media. Now we have AI. I don't know if anyone saw recently the speech that the new Argentinian president gave at Davos, but it was run through an AI adapter that not only immediately translated his speech, but actually moved his lips as if he were speaking English. Now that, to me, is wonderful, but it's also super scary because who knows how those lips are being moved, and if that translation is even accurate. One could almost immediately see applications to the political sphere, having political candidates, having their speech manipulated in such a way that, it certainly was not what the original intent of the message was. But at the same time, we have these issues, regulations, laws around free speech. Talk a little bit about what is unique about an election season and political engagement as it relates to your work.
Right. Well, as many of you, I'm sure, know, 2024 is going to be an exceptional year precisely because such a vast portion of the world's population is engaging in fundamental elections this year. I think it's about 2 billion people will be voting in elections for their national leaders around the world this year in different elections. So that question is absolutely one of the most urgent and critical, and the influence of social media on all of those elections is going to be vast. I think it's important to underscore that the first and foremost obligation is to protect the possibility of citizens and voters to exchange information, to debate reasonably, and to know what's going on with their leaders. And that's easy to overlook because we look at the problems, right? The problems of deception, the problems of incitement. And we do have to pay attention to those problems. There's various cases regarding elections that the Oversight Board has already decided. For example, relating to a general in Brazil who, after the last election, very similar to what happened here on January 6th, clearly incited violence and an attack on the Capitol. And Meta failed to take that down, and we overruled them and said you needed to take that down. You were aware that there was a crisis situation emerging. You should have been prepared for it, and there are certain kinds of threats to democratic discourse where precisely in order to protect the institutions of democracy, it comes down. At the same time, though, you take something like manipulated media. It's a much harder thing than incitement to violence, right? With manipulated media, we have another case that's about to come out any day in this next week.
And if we could just define a little bit, because even in preparation for this, I really wasn't aware that term manipulated media is actually a term of art.
Yes.
So if you could talk just...
Well, you're referring in your opening remarks there to, what is colloquially called, sort of AI-generated media, often called deep fakes. But manipulated media is much broader than that and covers everything from simply a doctored photo to an audio track that simulates someone else's voice and so forth. The technology is getting more and more sophisticated by the day. It's very hard to keep up with it. So the case that we're about to decide, we have decided, and the case will be published shortly, has to do actually with manipulated media here in the United States. It involves a video that was posted and when it was manipulated in such a way as to make it appear that President Biden was caressing his granddaughter's breast and calling him a pedophile, right? What do you do with that? What do you do with that, especially given that the technology makes it extraordinarily difficult to keep up with all the different ways in which this is doctored? And that the doctoring of media can be everything from, like, I don't like that my hair is turning gray, so I'm gonna take that out with the pixel changes, or something that, as you implied, is completely generated from scratch and has people saying what they never said.
Right.
So, it seems to me that the most important thing here, keeping in mind that fundamental importance of the free exchange of information that is necessary to democracy, is that we make it as transparent as possible what's going on, right? So that voters, citizens, the public know what they're getting, can be important, aware, informed recipients and consumers of the information that's in front of them. That's in a certain sense the current version of the very traditional answer to problematic speech, which is the solution is more speech. The solution is better speech. The solution is quality, and not forms of restriction that, although well-intentioned, will necessarily have the ancillary effect of restricting the scope of what we're able to discuss and debate together.
Now, Knox, in the sphere where you're so expert in global international religious freedom, religious liberty, the use of social media platforms and communicating messages actually has a couple different contexts to it. One is certainly allowing religious minorities to communicate one to another. The other is that to the degree, especially when states or powerful religious denominations within states accuse others of promoting blasphemy. And so that there's a little bit, there may not necessarily be something said that's a lie or so-called misinformation, but it can be interpreted by some as blasphemy, as a way of squelching free speech. Talk a little bit about the unique concerns that you bring to this question about how social media platforms are being used to communicate messages that impinge upon religious freedom.
Well, at one level, you have some humorous examples. You probably saw a few weeks ago this picture of Pope Francis wearing the giant white puffer coat that was supposed to be Gucci, and how could this humble priest be wearing that? And it was a fake. It was misinformation, disinformation. You might have missed a few years ago, there was a picture of the Russian Orthodox Patriarch Kirill at a meeting, and showed his bare wrist where he would have a watch, but there was nothing on his wrist. But in the reflection on the polished table, you saw a reflection of a gold watch. The gold watch was like a $30,000 Rolex that someone in the patriarchate had digitized out because it's embarrassing that the priest can afford a $30,000 Rolex. So these are some funny ways where these questions enter into the space of religious freedom, religious actors, but in all seriousness, it does have deadly consequences. We have seen where platforms like Facebook, which I do give them credit for creating the Meta Oversight Board to start to try to grapple with these challenges, but you also have tools like WhatsApp, Twitter, Telegram, used to say a person from a different community has done something that we don't like, let's go get them. And so there are constant examples in places like India of mobs being rallied through these social media platforms, and people die because of it. Sri Lanka, I visited Sri Lanka when I was at the State Department a few days after a Muslim community was just burned to the ground because a radical Buddhist had said some things about them raping their women and children, which just weren't true. But these platforms allowed that type of activity. So I like to think of it as there's sort of sins of commission and sins of omission. Sins where these companies are facilitating things that can lead to religious freedom violations, or are sort of allowing it to happen and turning a blind eye. So, how are they monitoring the chat rooms in, Sinhala, Urdu, even Arabic, and being mindful of what are the real world implications of that? This blasphemy law, 84 countries in the world have a blasphemy law. 4 of them that carry the death penalty, Pakistan being by and far the worst. Pakistan is now looking to enforce its filtering system that prevents what they consider blasphemous material from coming into their internet systems, enforcing those penalties in an extrajudicial manner. So there's an American Ahmadi Muslim who has been charged by the Pakistani government with the crime of blasphemy, which carries the death penalty, even though he's never set foot in Pakistan, but because something he said about his denomination of Islam was deemed blasphemous. So this is sort of how it has real world implications. It does can carry life and death seriousness, and so I do applaud Meta for creating the oversight board, and it's been someone who, thanks to Rachel, has been involved in some of the learning about the work. It's wickedly difficult because the amount of information that's generated is overwhelming. I mean, I just think about what my boys are scrolling through every night times 8 billion people, and how do you govern that? How do you create rules that either the AI is smart enough to understand, or when these sort of sui generis examples come up, how do you deal with it? It's a question I'm glad you're dealing with.
Well, I want to come back to you, Knox, just on that question, because you've raised the specter of government involvement. Obviously, Meta is not a government agency, and I want to talk with you in a second about how you think government should be involved. What's the public policy relationship that we should be thinking about? But it is an incredible quandary, isn't it, that the power of social media, which we have seen in a number of places around the world, is that it is an empowering mechanism for minorities, whether they be religious or other. It provides a voice to the world in a way that few other platforms can. At the same time, when taken over by majority powers, whether they be governments or religious denominations or so forth, can be used to squelch that as well, or to accuse others if a certain something is posted, and maybe posted in a way that it can be interpreted to be blasphemous. You have the opposite problem. As you said, there's no real good answer here, and we're glad that there are people like Paolo and others involved, and I'm glad that there are people like you also involved in this as well. But on par, where do you see the kind of balance of the good of social media? Are you seeing it empowering religious minorities in such a way that they can get messages out about things that are happening in ways that we wouldn't know otherwise? Or are you seeing it more used by majority powers, governments, religious denominations to squelch and attack religious minorities?
I mean, the answer is yes. So both are happening. I mean, I think we all experienced during COVID the miracle of Zoom to do work or worship, like we sort of forget that 5 years ago that didn't really exist, and now it's just a part of our sadly everyday life now. But it provided a way for us to have religious community in that incredible period of lockdown. We've seen that in other places where co-religionists can meet and educate and encourage their brothers and sisters from afar when they're in the most difficult of circumstances. But governments are raising walls to either protect their societies from different political ideas or religious ideas, and sometimes the two are fused together. So I was looking at the Freedom House Internet Freedom in the World report. A country like India, where it's very plugged in, there are 1 billion social media users in India. So it's massive, massive, massive. They get a score of 50, ranked as partly free. And there's good and bad there. Like, we know that churches, we know that Muslim communities, we know that others, Hindu communities, are able to connect in ways that would be impossible because of distance and time zones and just the expense. But we also know, like I mentioned earlier, these tools are used to oppress, to maim, and murder. Saudi Arabia and Pakistan both have a score of 26, so they're partly free, or I guess they're not free in their scale. They have much stricter filters. They have blasphemy laws that carry very serious penalties for people who are caught, and they're sort of protecting their religious political ideology from challenges both within their Islamic faith or from other faiths or other systems, and it's very effective. And of course, the best of the worst is China. They scored a 9 out of 100 on the Freedom House Index.
How'd they get high?
And it was 9 years in a row that they've come in dead last in the Freedom House score. And there they've got something called the Great Firewall. And they have created a completely different, completely insulated ecosystem with their own versions of Twitter and Amazon. And it's impenetrable, and their surveillance system is ever present. So you would hear stories of a guy who went to a concert who was wanted by the police, 100,000 people in this concert stands, but because their CCTV is so pervasive, the police went to the row and the upper deck and arrested him because they caught him. So China is literally in an Orwellian phase of how they're using technology to suppress different religious communities, the Uyghur Muslims, Tibetan Buddhists, Christians, Falun Gong, but also any sense of questioning, not even the Communist Party, but Chairman Xi, with very severe penalties. And this is all aided and abetted by technology. And I think the question as someone who was in policy is, well, what does this mean for these companies? We can't ask the companies not to obey the laws of the countries they're operating in, but I think we can't ask them not to operate in those countries. I think there's a sort of a moral question of how much do we value our values? If we really value freedom of speech, we really value religious freedom, should American companies be operating in a Pakistan, in a Saudi Arabia, in a China, and aiding and abetting this oppression? They have to obey the laws if they're there, but they don't have to be there.
Right.
And I think we should be asking that question. But at the same time, I'm complicit. I use Facebook. I'll be tweeting about this tonight. And so that's the conundrum we face.
Yes. Well, Paolo, then let's talk a little bit about the challenges. I mean, Meta obviously is operating globally. Some of the challenges that you see brought before you are coming from around the world, not just the United States. And different countries have different laws and regimes as it relates to free speech. What do you see as the relationship between policymakers, government, and Meta and the work that you're doing on the oversight board?
Yeah, there's so much to say there, and I agree with everything that Knox said, so that helps me not have to repeat so much of it. So I guess a couple of background points that I think are relevant to the larger questions that you're posing. One is there's a deep tension between having a global platform that at some level needs to be governed by global norms, right? That's part of the point. That's what we like about the internet, about social media, is exactly that capacity to reach across borders, across peoples, across languages, et cetera, right? So you need some standards that are going to be in common. And yet so much of what we're talking about is context specific, right? The particular nature of the ethnic conflict that's going on between Hindus and Muslims in this particular province of India, right?
Yeah,
And-
so if that had happened in another context, it wouldn't be the same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do you take that contextual reality into account and at the same time truly respect the universality of certain norms of human rights that we hold dear and that are necessary to the global platform, nature of the platform? And it is, to quote you earlier, a wickedly difficult problem, probably the most persistent problem that we face across all the decisions we have. And I say that because it carries into this more specific area of how you deal with governments and government connections to platforms as well, right? On the one hand, we have to be concerned about the Chinese model of authoritarianism, but also about, maybe still relatively blunt but not quite as authoritarian models where, internet shutdowns are used nationally in order to restrict information. Or even more subtle, the governments that engage in set up what become known as internet referral units, and they have groups of people who their entire job is to look for content that the government doesn't like online, and then send requests to the platforms asking that to be taken down. Right? They don't have any formal authority, but the platform. So we had a case there where even a country strong, liberal electoral democracy like the United Kingdom is doing that and exercising an important influence behind the scenes in a non-transparent way on what stays up and what comes down on these platforms, because they're quietly saying, hey, we didn't really like that, so would you please take it down?
Yeah.
And because the companies have an interest in maintaining good relations and having these markets, a lot of times they'll do that.
It'd be terrible if something happened to your mom over here. Was it one of those arm twisting? It'd be really terrible if you somehow closed down your office in London.
That line can be crossed all too easily, right? And even in our country, right, we had a huge policy advisory opinion that dealt with, where Facebook referred to us questions of how they should be dealing with COVID misinformation. Okay, and an important part of that policy opinion was an analysis of all of the different ways in which they were in contact with the U.S. government, receiving, sort of instructions essentially about what should come down. And the point that we tried to make most of all is the need for transparency, right? In order to hold there to be accountability for these kinds of actions on the part of government, people need to know. It can't be behind the curtains. Voters need to know. Civil society needs to know what the governments are involved in. So that's the first major step. Now, there's so much more to say, but I'll just add one more point from a very different direction, but in part because of the important issues that Knox raised. The answer to government overreach might be sometimes simply saying we're not going to do business there, right? But a lot of times it's a much more complicated question, right? Because at what point does the overreach become too much, right? And even more importantly, how do you balance it against exactly the benefits that you were raising? People get voice.
Yeah.
Government opposition gets voice, right? Iran is an importantly authoritarian government that tries to exploit the internet to monitor and surveil and shut down religious minorities, okay? But social media is also an essential platform for the opposition to organize in Iran. So if you pull out, you also pull those tools out of their hands.
Yeah.
And how you try and reconcile those is a really hard and a question that needs sort of constant re-examination according to the very specific circumstances of what's going on.
Yeah, very good. Can I ask you a couple more questions, and then I want to open it up to you all. So be ready to engage in this terrific conversation. Knox, in our prep call, you had mentioned a recent conversation with, I believe it was a military official of some sort, who had said, and this is the quote that I had, reality is the next battlefield. Give us some context for that, and what do you think that means particularly for religious freedom?
I thought it was a great quote because it really encapsulated in a pithy way, I think, what so many of us are experiencing with AI and deep fakes and even the funny story about the Pope and the big puffy jacket. What is real, what isn't? And not only do I look like Tom Cruise with this filter or not, but did I really say that? The Argentinian president.
Yeah,
you thought it was cool. It kind of freaked me out because I don't know what he was saying. I don't speak Spanish.
Let's say I thought it was cool and it freaked me out.
Okay, good.
Like both.
But I could see this being applied to religious leaders.
Yes. Totally
Faking them saying one thing or another to have, again, these real world consequences of he said something blasphemous, he's an apostate, and let's go get him, or let's charge him with the death penalty.
Or they could be calling people up to attack someone.
And we know that there are state actors that are very savvy in using these tools to also interject these different views of reality through bots and just troll farms to influence societies in a direction that's to their benefit. And I don't know the solution to that, but it's a question that is truly a 21st century question that we've never had to engage before. And the kind of parameters that have been set up, I think, are a good starting point. But at the same time, I think this is where there is a need for strong government to government. Like, we know what you're doing, stop it. Either with how you're trying to influence our society or how you're trying to prevent and twist your own society's view of us or others. The United States, we are still a superpower. We still have immense global reach and influence. I think in my book that's coming out, I say, across administrations, I think we steward that poorly. That we can flex a bit more on these value issues to encourage partners and adversaries to behave a different way. And I think this is one of those things that is pretty low on the policymakers' to-do list, if anything, because they don't understand it. I mean, there was a hearing today in Congress about Facebook, and some of the questions were, they should have talked to their kids or their grandkids before they asked the question. But they're super technical. I go to the oversight board meetings and I get lost pretty quickly with the techies. And so there's a level of knowledge that's needed, but at the same time, there's the principles that I think the United States shines best and brightest when we're forward-leaning with them. And this needs to be an issue that gets a little further up the to-do list, in my opinion.
Paolo, a question about this election year, and what are some of the things that you're thinking about are the most concerning, or things that, whether, as you said, it's not just elections here in the States. You've got 2 billion people, a quarter of the world population may be voting or are estimated to be voting this year. What are some of the things that you're thinking about that concern you, either about the United States or in other places of the world?
Well, it's, boy, the list is long. The list is long. I mean, like a lot of people, the rise of generative AI poses enormous new risks in that area, and it's going to be really interesting and hopefully not as problematic as many people fear. But it's an open question in the election context. But maybe taking a little bit of a less expected sort of take on it, Pete. I want to answer the question by going back to the quote that Knox is commenting on about reality.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I think that's actually the biggest problem, right? And what I mean is not simply that the election field will be spread, seeded with a lot of bad information and misinformation in a post-truth society where we don't know what's real, and so reality becomes a battlefield in election. That's true. But there's something even deeper going on, and that I think, especially here in the context of something hosted by Pepperdine. I mean, your program teaches public policy by having people read great books. Yeah. That means something, right? That's the fundamental problem. The problem is the desire and an appreciation for the truth.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Yep.
And we live in a context in which it's increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for people, especially young people, to judge
Yeah.
what is true,
Yeah.
to discern what is right. They're flooded with information. They have no capacity for judgment about it because they've never been formed in this capacity.
Yeah.
And everything is undermining our ability to do that.
Or worse, they've been formed in an ideological way that they're willing to believe certain things.
So we can talk about social media influencing elections all we want, but if we don't have the capacity to form virtuous citizens who desire the truth and judge it, then all of the rest of it doesn't matter. If we do have that, then the problems of social media will be resolved, right? So, it starts, I mean, this is not to sort of let companies like Meta off the hook by any means. I'm on the oversight board because I want to hold them accountable, not let them off the hook. But there is an important dimension where we have to acknowledge that there's at stake a lot of personal agency and responsibility in this field too.
Yeah.
And if we forget that, then all the rest of it doesn't matter.
Yeah. No, that's really good.
Both and, not either or.
Yeah.
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 Let's open it up for questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ash Kazarian.
Oh, we're actually audio recording
Very
this.
step forward.
Yes.
Oh, you're going to hold it. Thank you. Hi, I'm Ash Kazarian, Senior Fellow at Stand Together. My question was, you talked about India
Yep.
and really just the diversity there and the tensions. WhatsApp is the most used app in India, and most of those chats are actually encrypted. And the tension here also becomes, do you keep the encryption in these apps? Because you said something about, well, the platforms should have done more and they should have maybe done something to prevent these conflicts in real life. But if a platform has an end-to-end encrypted communication going on and they can't see what's going on, the decision becomes, do we bring encryption in a country that has a bad freedom index and already has been having a lot of tensions and persecuting people and having their own freedom of speech suppression? So can you talk a little bit more about that trade-off?
Yeah.
You too.
Yeah.
I mean, you've identified the conundrum, right? Because India is increasingly, under Modi's leadership, such as it is, the space for civil society is shrinking. The space for religious diversity is under immense pressure, both at the federal level and at the various states. And at one level, the human rights defenders. I wrote an article for Time when Modi came to visit Washington. I was encouraging the Indians to do better and encouraging our government to challenge them to do better. I interviewed a lot of Indian activists, and it was all through WhatsApp because it was end-to-end encryption. That enabled me to get some interesting quotes, to get some nuances, and then also to find out, can I quote you or not? Some yes, some no, most no, actually, because they were so worried about it. So that's the good side, and on the downside, we see like these mobs forming. So I don't have the answer to it, and I think that's the challenge. There is no clear answer for the WhatsApp. Now on the Facebook platforms, that's where I do think there is ability where you see the pages being filled with hateful rhetoric and things being organized in an obscure language that better oversight can police it and make it harder for it to be used as an organizing principle to do harm. But then Paolo's point was right, that is the other side going to take that away from the democracy, the pro-democracy people who need this ability to communicate in a disparate manner. So I think the sad reality is there is no easy, clean answer. And this is where my technological expertise is minimal. And we'll need to get smart people like at Meta, like at these companies. We need to ask them to help us solve it. Because it's one thing for the human rights community to say this is a problem. We need the smart people who run these things to design them to help figure out the answer.
I used to work at Meta. We used to call that, when governments or civil society told us to figure it out, we called it nerd harder.
Nerd harder.
You can just nerd harder
Yeah.
and figure this out.
Yeah.
Which maybe one day they will.
I think but again, it's sort of like it's going to take everybody, both the human rights community, the democracy community, governments, private sector, to create rules for this space and to help solve these very tricky questions. But I'm sure you've got
Yeah, no,
insights.
I mean, just building on that, I guess I would take it even a step further and say not only is there not a solution, there never will be a solution that is stable, right? It's a constant struggle. It's a constant struggle. If you go back 20 years, right, when we thought, so many of us, oh, the internet is going to be this new flowering of freedom and solidarity and peace in the world, okay? What was the fundamental error there? We forgot that some people are evil, right? We forgot about the capacity of the human heart for sin. And every tool that you put out there will be people who are trying to exploit it to do bad things. Every rule that you create, the moment you create it, the moment you create an algorithm to try to filter out the bad stuff, there will be people there working as hard as they possibly can to figure out how to circumvent it. Okay? That kind of adversarial behavior is permanent and constant. And so it's a constant struggle that you have to try to get around it. You can't avoid it.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm curious how you think about how algorithms play into this story. That it's almost as if not all posts are created equal. Some will get boosted more than others. Just what are the different aspects of thinking about that question? What do you promote? What do you not promote? How do you balance de-promoting versus pulling a post and so on?
Yeah, well, I'll be happy to be really blunt for starters and say, I think the question of algorithmic moderation, in particular, the question of demotion, downranking, shadow banning, whatever term you want to use for it, is one of the most urgent and important unaddressed problems in this space right now. Largely because we don't really know how it works. We don't know what's happening. We don't know what's going into making those decisions. It's really hard to peel it back. Now, the recently enacted European Union regulations, the Digital Services Act, is going to require companies to be more transparent about how algorithms, how they prioritize information. That'll be sort of an interesting step and see what is gained for that. But just to give you an example, in December, the Oversight Board decided two urgent cases, expedited cases, coming out of the October 7th attacks in Israel and then the military response in Gaza. And in both of those cases, we discovered, quite by accident, the enormous role that just some tweaks in the, what are known as the confidence levels, right? The percentage certainty at which content is removed by the automated systems. Meta was, in well-intentioned reasons, was worried about graphic and violent rhetoric, the glorification of the attacks of October 7th, so good reasons. And so they lower these confidence thresholds. And what immediately happens is that massive amounts of information having to do with the conflict from both sides was being removed, just automatically disappeared. People couldn't even talk about what was going on because that small tweak in the algorithm ended up essentially exercising an enormous sort of black blanket over the information system there. And so in both of those cases, we overturned their initial decisions and said, you have to err here in favor of additional information because people have to know in these conflict situations and in these violent terrorist attacks what is going on. And so it is really urgent that we try and find out more about how they work. I think even the companies themselves often don't understand what they're doing, what the practical consequences of it are going to be.
Some questions in the back.
So we've talked a lot about truth and accuracy, and we've never actually had good definitions. That's the whole point. We don't know what truth is. That's why the pursuit of it has mattered to all of us for such a long time. So the question that I have is, you mentioned the Joe Biden example. I'm thinking more about when you get fact-checked. Something is fact-checked, or anything is, you talked about demoting and shadow banning. But occasionally, there's a tendency to do narrative control. And I think there's a narrative truth that's easily impacted by a lot of these decisions. So if you were to fact-check something on I don't know, something common about the FDA. There are many people who would say the FDA has truth conferred upon it by being a federal agency, and there are many other people who would say just the opposite thing, exactly the opposite thing, that it has sort of contravened its own mandate. So how do you control for narrative when you're making a decision? How do you pick a side? I mean, how could you possibly pick a side in a transparent way?
Thanks. That's a super interesting question. I think that's why we protect freedom of expression, right? Why we protect freedom of expression independently of whether we agree with the person or not, whether it's the narrative that we like. It's in the confrontation of the different facts and interpretation of those facts that we encourage a discourse in which a greater understanding of the reality will come out if it's right. So you precisely the narrative you choose is a narrative of the importance of freedom of expression being protected, right? Now, the second thing I would say is that even in the context where people are not in any sort of conscious or intentional way exercising biases, we all have preconceptions. We all have our own ideas, and that certainly is true of the particular subset of tech professionals and executives who operate in Menlo Park and are running these programs. I mean, they have their particular ways of looking at the world, and so what that says to me is that an experiment like the oversight board represents. And I say that because it's the only thing that exists like it in any of the companies, right? It's a completely unprecedented and unique experiment, and we don't know if it's going to be successful in the long run. We're trying desperately to make it so. But why do we want it to be so? Because exactly what you say demonstrates the need for independent oversight, right? An external body. We're a diverse group of people. They've recruited us and deliberately to represent a variety of different points of view, and we work really hard in our deliberations to reach some sort of consensus and agreements, and despite those differences, and we disagree hard, and that's what you can get with an independent oversight body like ours. That if you're just making decisions in the echo chamber of a boardroom with the same group of executives, you're going to get the domination by certain preconceived narratives instead.
Thanks for your contribution so far. I am curious to hear your perspective about the nexus of usage and mental health crisis / addiction. And so we have a perpetuating of quote unquote going down the rabbit hole. We have situations where there's an increasing number of Osama bin Laden / Gaddafi / Putin sympathizers. Yet we're in the middle of two major wars in those respective regions. And so could you just speak a little bit about that perspective? Perhaps someone's trying to find truth, but yet being led in a direction that may not allow them to find truth, one. And then second, through social media. And then second, are we in a position where we need a massive disclaimer, i.e. the 1950s cigarette usage, we thought that nicotine was good, but it just created addiction and it was bad?
Do you want to start?
I'm just reminded when I've gone to different European countries, some of the cigarette boxes have like the pictures of the cancer
Lungs.
to really,
Yes.
really scare you off. So I would love to scare my boys off social media for a little while because it's so all-consuming. How do we, again, it gets to sort of the presentation, how is it managed? This question of what is the role of, from the space I come from, this question of what is the role of government in determining spiritual truth? And so what the questions I'm dealing with is government's raising these walls, filtering things out because a certain interpretation of a certain faith says this is the way to truth, this is the way to God, and all other things are not only wrong, we're not even gonna let them into the country. You can't even read about it. And I think that is just a completely inappropriate place for government. Government is poorly equipped to make those decisions. So in my world, those are the kind of places I intersect with your questions, but I would kick it back to you for the deep answer.
Yeah, well, deep, I don't know. I would say three really, really brief points. One, yes, it's a huge problem. The question of child safety in all sorts of different respects, including mental health and self-harm, is one of the, I think, biggest areas that we have to focus on. Second, I would say, so this last semester I taught a course on the regulation of social media, okay? I had 12 students in my seminar. These are law students, right? So, this is a generation that grew up with social media from the time they could toddle. On day one, before we talked about any of the problems, I asked them, how many of you, if you had a 12-year-old daughter, would let your daughter use social media?
Yeah.
Okay? 10 out of the 12 said no. Now, that was really, that surprised me. But I think it's really significant. In other words, it said to me that overwhelmingly the next generation is much more aware than I was when I was a parent of teenagers of the harms involved. And I think there's something promising in that. There's a greater awareness than there has been. There's still a lot more to do, but there's some reason for hope. The last thing I would say is this, and maybe this is more, sort of goes back to the question of spiritual truth and religious truth. We have to offer young people something else too, right? I mean, you can't just say this is bad. Social media fills a vacuum of meaning. It fills a vacuum of desire. They're being taught that their self-importance and significance depends on being able to be like the influencer that they saw on TikTok. And if we don't give young people something else that is more permanent and more meaningful and deeper to desire for their lives, then of course we're not going to be able to eradicate this problem, right? So there's a supply and a demand problem, okay? And it's easy to just focus on how bad the social media is and supplying stuff to them that's bad, but we need to supply them with something else instead too.
What do you think about like banning the like button? Because I think about, Michael Bloomberg banned the big gulp in New York City, and I thought that was silly. Like, people should be free to get 1 million calories in one Coke. But with Twitter, the like button is that dopamine hit, right? Yeah. People get addicted to it. I've even, I like it when people like what I post.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would be your view on that? Like that kind of just removing the thing that kind of gives people the incentive to stay online.
So I think if you look at the empirical studies, the introduction of the like button is very directly correlated with the rise of a lot of the problematic behaviors in social media that we saw.
Yeah.
And so presumably reversing it might help it to address the problem. My skepticism, though, is that the technological environment is changing so rapidly and all the time that you can't just undo something, right?
Yeah. That is known.
There are a dozen other problems that have emerged since then, or that will emerge tomorrow in order to replace that, or something else. So it might not be a bad idea, but we have to be sort of constantly vigilant.
No silver bullet here. Yeah.
It's sort of like the Harry Potter guy, constant vigilance.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Hi. So I have a comment and a concern. So I saw today that Director Wray of the FBI testified on the Hill that China is being prepositioned to cause all types of chaos and havoc. And we have a perfect storm coming in that we're going to go through an election cycle. And I honestly am not looking forward to this election cycle because I think there will be a massive use of social media to discredit and encourage people and with bad information. So my comment is I'm concerned about that, and a question, and I know you probably can't answer, what can we do as ordinary citizens with all this havoc? Because there are bad actors that will try. I mean, anytime a sitting U.S. president has to ask his Chinese counterpart to not interfere with our election, that speaks volumes for where we are as a country. You don't have to comment on it. It's just a concern.
Yeah, I think this is a question for you.
Yeah.
I mean, you're the dean of the public policy school. What are we going to do about this?
Right.
problem?
Well, here's what you do. Now, I think we're still not, as a country, and part of it, we're confounded by the complexity of social media and technology, that we don't fully understand that dimension of the battlefield, and that it is a battlefield. And so everybody kind of understands when a tank, shoots a bomb or a plane drops something or military leader or soldiers are invading something. But I heard something the other day from a talk that was given by one of the leaders of U.S. Cyber Command. And she said something that really has stuck with me, that the difference between understanding cyber warfare compared to any other warfare is that the cyber war began at least 20 years ago and hasn't stopped since. We are at war now. And I think unless and until we understand the comprehensiveness of the fact that there are actors in the Chinese government, and yes, in the United States, against people that we don't want to call our enemies, but they are indeed acting like enemies, I don't think we as an American public are really being fully prepared as self-governing citizens to understand that dimension of conflict. And so when it does happen, like happened with some might remember when we understand it was Russian hackers that got involved in shutting down the fuel lines and the gas stations in the Southeast. We were told in some ways, and I don't think that actually our government was frankly completely transparent with us, that those were hackers and it's something that we're dealing with. That could easily be seen as an act of war, right? Now, if we were responding militarily to every cyber attack, we would be in a state of constant war. And again, I just think it's in some ways because most people don't understand that dimension of warfare in the same way that we understand the kinetic style of warfare. That when it does come to grids being shut down or other types of attacks that get through our ability, say, at U.S. Cyber Command to confront, we're not going to be ready for it. And the engagement in elections is, in my view, an act of war, and should be communicated as such. Again, putting in the context that it's different than if another Pearl Harbor happened or 9/11 happened, but still needs to be seen at least in somewhat of a similar context.
Thank you. First, just a note of sympathy, or agreement. When you mentioned these problems aren't going to go away, I'm reminded of a quotation from Reinhold Niebuhr in terms of his definition of politics. So, politics is finding temporary solutions to intractable problems. Both,
That's good.
I'm disposed to think that Americans think a lot of things have solutions. My usual response is, mathematics has solutions. Most of human life doesn't. You just deal with it. Anyway, a general comment. The other one is sort of equally abstract, but these questions of artificial intelligence and fakery and so on are to do with remote learning. That is, these are things which happen when you're interacting with a screen all the time, or now verbally if you're listening to things and voice recognition. What is lost is the sheer physicality of being a human being. This comes up in the transhumanist stuff, as if you could take an intelligence and plant it somewhere and you would have a human being, there aren't intelligences floating around. There are human beings floating around. You take their body away and the intelligence goes away as well. A utopian thing, to the degree, or on a lesser level, which you already indicated with your students is coming, to break away from these things, to actually interact with another human being and talk with them, rather than, and to the degree we can, and we never can wholly, get away from this mediated interaction with others. Anyway, that's just a few abstract, useless thoughts.
Well, can I make an abstract and useless remark in response? Your comment brings to mind, some of you may know this obscure reference. There was a man named by the name John Perry Barlow. You may know who John Perry Barlow was. Well, you do because you were at Meta. Barlow was, I think his most famous claim to fame was that he was one of the lyricists for the Grateful Dead. But other than that, what he was is he was the first sort of techno-libertarian utopianist. And in 1996, he wrote this very famous declaration, the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, right? And it still, to this day, is extremely influential among people who work in the tech world and sort of the ideology, right? I see you nodding your head here in the front. And Barlow's declaration, the reason I mention it is it's full of the language of disembodiment, right? The internet is a world of the mind. We know we don't exist in bodies. We're outside of all sovereignties. We're outside of all governments. And we're going to bring a world of peace and utopia, right? It's an amazingly misguided document and extraordinarily influential. And if we didn't already know in 1996 that it was a crackpot sort of way of thinking about it, we know because we see tangibly the results every day of that lie, right? We're not disembodied. We live in a material world. We live in relationship with people. And so I couldn't agree more that
and that's a good thing.
And it's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
Yeah.
But if we don't ask the significance of that, so now to link the first part of it, I love Reinhold Niebuhr too, and so I'll answer a quote with a quote. My favorite quote from Reinhold Niebuhr is saying, "Nothing is more absurd than the answer to a question that is not asked." Right? So if we don't ask the question about what it means to live material embodied lives in relationship to the internet, we're never going to understand what the answer could be to the problems that we're facing.
We have time for one more, and these two are going to hang out for a bit, so there'll be plenty of time to engage them, but yes.
Real quickly, going back to the manipulated media point in the AI conversation, at the state and local level especially, including federal, lawmakers are already advancing proposed solutions to address the use of AI and deepfakes in elections. I think 5 states have already taken action. I think at least 50 bills in over 23 states are in the works right now. That ranges the gamuts from some sort of blanket transparency disclosure statement on a political advertisement. But some of this has me troubled from a free speech perspective, especially thinking First Amendment rights. Like, I can't think of more protected speech than election speech. So just how are you thinking about some of these proposals that have been introduced at the state and federal level? And I'll just take it from there.
There's a lot to say. I guess let me sort of stay at a higher level of generality. Maybe might be more the only useful thing I could say. On the regulatory level, we are now in a world where the European Union is by default the arbiter of global regulation on these issues. For better and for worse. There's some things that have gone on there that are positive and worthwhile and worth appreciating, and there's certain aspects of the approach that I think are quite misguided there. But regardless of that, the mere fact that they have entered this space with a decisive regulatory approach makes the European Union the default standard globally that everybody else is sort of reacting to or imitating or whatever else. I say that because, by contrast, I think one of the biggest problems we have is simply that in the political conflict and polarization and fragmentation and incapacity to actually legislate for the common good in this country, we are essentially delegating, right, the entire approach to these areas of AI, social media regulation, and so forth to others, rather than the United States exercising the kind of global leadership that historically it did and that it should be exercising in this. And so, aside from the specific problems of how it might impinge on aspects of freedom of the First Amendment, I think the mere fact that we're looking at like a handful of individual states taking this approach in different ways and nothing coherent going on at the federal level is itself an enormous structural problem that puts us at a serious competitive disadvantage in the world.
Please join me in thanking our guests. And thank you all for joining us this evening. You know, it strikes me, one of my takeaways from this evening, Paolo, is when you said that many of the challenges that we are thinking about as it relates to manipulated media and the abuse of social media platforms is that it is happening in a world that is, and in a nation that has become increasingly challenged in their search for truth. And the same thing strikes me about your work too, Knox, is that this is also happening at a time when the world, much less the United States, seems to be unprepared for a true, strong defense of religious liberty and religious freedom. And that this is now happening on a different battlefield, if you will. And if nations, if religious denominations, if leaders in civil society are not going to stand for religious freedom in other dimensions of life, how can we expect them to continue that defense when it comes to these areas where social media is being abused in this way? In the same way, if schools, I would argue, like Pepperdine, like a Notre Dame, are not inculcating, preparing the next generation of citizens to pursue the truth and to do that in a civil way, these issues are just going to be magnified and exacerbated. It's essentially just a transition of a responsibility from culture into some other dimension of life. And that's why I'm just so grateful for the work I get to do at Pepperdine and the policy school, and so grateful to work with people like Knox, and Paolo's been so great to partner with you on this. Obviously, I know our friends at the Oversight Board are deeply interested in these issues, and so Rachel, it's been great to partner with you, and here in DC, our friends Sarah and Mark at the Institute for Religion and Democracy has been another great event. So if you're not on our mailing list, make sure you speak with Emily Milnes in the back there. She is our Director of Recruitment and Program Relations at the Policy School, because we're going to keep doing these things here in DC, hosting these unique conversations. And again, thanks so much for joining us this evening.